In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine with perfectly trimmed lawns and sparkling clean driveways, life was usually calm. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect world, there was a simmering tension. At the heart of this tension was Grandpa Joe, an 80-year-old man who had lived in the same house for over 40 years. He wasn't flashy or loud, just a simple, hard-working guy who loved his garden, his tools, and his sweet iced tea. Grandpa Joe had retired long ago from his job as a mechanic, but he still kept himself busy fixing things around the house. His backyard was his pride and joy. It had fruit trees, flower beds bursting with color, and even a small vegetable patch where he grew tomatoes and peppers. To him, the backyard wasn't just a piece of land. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the hustle and bustle of the world and find peace. But lately, that peace had been shattered by one particular group, the Homeowners Association, or HOA. The HOA was supposed to keep the neighborhood looking nice, but sometimes their rules felt more like nitpicking than helpful guidance. They sent letters about everything, from how high the grass should be cut to whether cars were parked in the right spots. For most people, these notices were annoying but manageable. For Grandpa Joe, though, they were becoming unbearable. The real issue wasn't the letters themselves. It was the way the HOA inspectors enforced them. You see, instead of knocking on doors or calling ahead like normal people, the inspectors had developed a habit of climbing over Joe's fence whenever they wanted to check something. This wasn't a rare occurrence either. It happened at least once a week, sometimes more. One day, while Joe was tending to his rose bushes, he heard the familiar sound of boots scraping against wood. Sure enough, when he looked up, there was another inspector perched awkwardly atop his fence, clipboard in hand. Joe sighed deeply. He didn't mind if someone needed to inspect his property. He understood that rules were part of living in a community. What bothered him was the lack of respect. Climbing over his fence without permission felt invasive, almost like breaking into his home. And yet, no matter how many times he mentioned it to the HOA, nothing changed. The inspectors continued to treat his fence like their personal gateway. As days turned into weeks, Joe grew increasingly frustrated. He tried talking to the HOA board members, but they dismissed his concerns with vague promises to look into it. He left polite notes on his gate asking visitors to use the front door, but those were ignored too. Each time he saw someone scaling his fence, it felt like a slap in the face, a reminder that his wishes didn't matter. One afternoon, after yet another uninvited visitor had climbed over his fence, Joe decided he'd had enough. Sitting on his porch with a cold glass of iced tea in hand, he stared at the offending structure. The wooden fence stood tall and sturdy, built by his own hands decades ago. It had weathered countless storms and provided privacy for his family. Yet now, it seemed to serve only as an obstacle course for nosy inspectors. "I've been patient," Joe muttered to himself, taking a sip of his tea. But patience has its limits. His mind began to wander as he thought about ways to deal with the situation. Confrontation wasn't his style. He wasn't the type to shout or argue. Besides, getting into a heated debate with the HOA wouldn't solve anything. No, Joe preferred subtler methods. Over the years, he'd learned that clever solutions often worked better than brute force. Whether it was fixing a stubborn engine or solving a tricky puzzle, Joe always relied on creativity and ingenuity. An idea started forming in his head. What if he could turn the tables on these trespassers? Instead of letting them barge into his yard unnoticed, what if he gave them a little surprise, something harmless but memorable enough to make them think twice before climbing his fence again? Joe leaned back in his chair, picturing the scene in his mind. He imagined an unsuspecting inspector hopping over the fence, expecting to stroll through his yard undisturbed. Then suddenly something unexpected would happen, something that would leave them startled and maybe even a little embarrassed. The thought brought a smile to Joe's face. He glanced at his workshop visible through the open garage door. Inside were shelves filled with tools, gadgets, and spare parts collected over decades of tinkering. There was plenty of material there to bring his idea to life. All he needed was a plan. Finishing his tea, Joe stood up and stretched. He felt a renewed sense of purpose. For too long, he'd let the HOA walk all over him. Now it was time to take matters into his own hands, not with anger or aggression, but with wit and humor. As he walked toward his workshop, he couldn't help but chuckle. Whoever decided to climb his fence next was in for quite the surprise. Little did Joe know, his decision to act would not only change his relationship with the HOA, but also turn him into an unlikely hero among his neighbors. But for now, he focused on the task at hand, eager to put his plan into motion. After all, sometimes the best way to make a point is with a touch of mischief, and perhaps a splash of iced tea. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Grandpa Joe sat on his porch with a fresh glass of iced tea. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers from his garden. It was the kind of peaceful moment Joe cherished most, the world slowing down just enough for him to think clearly. But tonight, his thoughts weren't drifting toward memories of the past or dreams of the future. Instead, they were laser-focused on one thing: how to handle the HOA inspectors who kept climbing his fence. Joe had always been a problem solver. When something broke around the house, he didn't call a repairman. He rolled up his sleeves and fixed it himself. If a neighbor needed help with their car or a loose railing, Joe was the first person they turned to. His knack for finding creative solutions had earned him a reputation as the go-to guy in the neighborhood. And now, faced with this new challenge, Joe's mind buzzed with possibilities. He leaned back in his chair, sipping his tea slowly, letting ideas bubble to the surface. He knew he wanted to teach the HOA a lesson, but not in a mean-spirited way. Joe wasn't the type to seek revenge or cause harm. No, what he envisioned was something playful, something that would make the inspectors think twice before trespassing again, while also giving them, and maybe even himself, a good laugh. Titian, idea came to him gradually, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. What if he could rig his gate to deliver a harmless but surprising reaction whenever someone tried to open it without permission? It wouldn't hurt anyone, but it would definitely catch them off guard. Joe smiled to himself, imagining the look on an inspector's face when they encountered his little invention. Excited by the thought, Joe set his empty glass down and headed to his workshop. The garage smelled of sawdust and oil, a comforting aroma that reminded him of countless projects over the years. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with tools, wires, spare parts, and odds and ends he'd collected over decades. There was everything, from old car batteries to bits of scrap metal, each item holding potential for some future creation. Joe scanned the shelves, his eyes lighting up as he spotted exactly what he needed. First, he grabbed an old battery, a small one, just powerful, enough to power his device without being dangerous. Next, he rummaged through a box of electrical components until he found a buzzer, the kind used in alarm clocks. He also picked out a few lengths of wire, a pressure switch, and a small canister of compressed air he'd saved from a previous project. These items would form the core of his plan. Back outside, Joe stood in front of his gate, studying it carefully. The gate was sturdy, made of weathered wood and reinforced with hinges that creaked slightly when opened. It was functional, if not particularly fancy, but it served its purpose well. Now Joe intended to give it a new function, one that would leave visitors scratching their heads. With his materials gathered, Joe got to work. He started by attaching the pressure switch to the latch mechanism inside the gate. This switch would act as a trigger, activating the rest of the system whenever someone tried to open the gate. Next, he connected the wires, running them neatly along the frame so they were barely noticeable. One end of the wiring led to the buzzer, which he mounted discreetly near the top of the gate. The other end was linked to the canister of compressed air, positioned strategically to release a quick burst when triggered. Joe worked methodically, his hands moving with practiced precision. Years of tinkering had taught him the importance of patience and attention to detail, and he applied those lessons now. Every connection was double-checked, every component secured tightly. He didn't want anything to malfunction, not because he feared injury, but because he wanted the effect to be perfect. As he assembled the final pieces, Joe couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. Here he was, an 80-year-old man, rigging his front gate like some sort of mad inventor. Yet there was a sense of satisfaction in knowing he was taking control of the situation in his own unique way. The HOA might have rules for everything, but Joe had something they didn't: creativity. By the time he finished, night had fallen completely. The streetlights cast a soft glow over his yard, illuminating the newly modified gate. Joe stepped back to admire his handy-good job. "Do you want me to continue expanding Part 3 next? Let me know if you'd like me to proceed with the same level of detail and style." The next 2 days passed quietly, almost too quietly for Grandpa Joe's liking. He spent his mornings tending to his garden, pruning roses and watering the vegetable patch. In the afternoons, he sat on his porch, sipping iced tea and keeping one eye on the fence. The gate stood silent and still, its secret mechanism waiting patiently for an unsuspecting visitor. Joe couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and amusement as he imagined the moment when someone would finally trigger it. On the third day, just as the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, Joe heard the sound he'd been waiting for: the unmistakable creak of footsteps on his wooden fence. He set down his glass of tea and leaned forward in his chair, a twinkle of mischief in his eyes. Sure enough, a figure appeared over the top of the fence, hoisting themselves awkwardly onto Joe's property. It was another HOA inspector, clipboard in hand, looking entirely out of place among the flowers and fruit trees. Joe watched silently from his porch as the man landed with a soft thud. The inspector brushed off his pants, adjusted his hat, and strode confidently toward the gate. Joe could see the man glance around briefly, perhaps expecting to find Joe somewhere nearby. But when no one appeared, the inspector shrugged and reached for the latch. The moment the gate clicked open, chaos erupted. A loud, piercing buzz filled the air, startling not just the inspector but also a flock of birds perched in a nearby tree. They took flight in a flurry of wings, adding to the commotion. Before the inspector could react, a sharp puff of air shot out from the gate, hitting him square in the chest. It wasn't painful, just enough to make him stumble backward in surprise. His clipboard clattered to the ground, and for a split second he looked like he might trip over his own feet. From his perch on the porch, Joe couldn't contain his laughter. He let out a hearty chuckle, the kind that comes from deep within, and called out cheerfully, "Can I help you?" The inspector spun around, wide-eyed and red-faced. He stared at Joe, clearly flustered, before stammering, I'm here to inspect your property for compliance." "Oh, is that all?" Joe replied, feigning innocence. "Well, why didn't you just knock on the front door like everyone else? You didn't have to go through all that trouble." The inspector opened his mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he bent down to retrieve his clipboard, avoiding eye contact. Without another word, he turned on his heel and hurried back toward the fence. Climbing over it proved just as awkward as climbing in, and by the time he disappeared from view, Joe was laughing so hard, tears were streaming down his face. Once the inspector was gone, Joe wiped his eyes and leaned back in his chair, thoroughly satisfied with the outcome. His little invention had worked perfectly. The buzzing noise and burst of air hadn't caused any harm, but they'd certainly made their point. Anyone who thought they could waltz into his yard uninvited would now think twice before doing so again. But Joe's satisfaction didn't stop there. As he sat sipping his tea, he began to imagine how this incident might ripple through the neighborhood. Word would spread quickly about what had happened. After all, small towns and tight-knit communities thrived on gossip. By tomorrow morning, everyone would know about the mysterious buzzing gate and the unfortunate inspector who had fallen victim to it. Sure enough, the very next day, Joe noticed a change in the atmosphere. Neighbors who rarely spoke to him stopped by to exchange pleasantries. Some even lingered long enough to ask subtle questions about the events of the previous evening. One woman, Mrs. Peterson, from across the street, gave him a knowing smile as she watered her plants. "Heard you've been having some visitors lately," she said casually. "Hope they learned their lesson." Joe grinned and tipped his hat. "Oh, I think they got the message loud and clear." Others weren't quite as direct but still hinted at their approval. Mr. Thompson, who lived 2 doors down, paused during his morning walk to comment on how peaceful the neighborhood seemed lately. Funny how things quiet down when people start minding their own business, he remarked, glancing pointedly at Joe's fence. Even the local coffee shop buzzed with chatter about the incident. Joe overheard snippets of conversation while picking up his usual order, a black coffee and a blueberry muffin. "Did you hear about old Joe's gate?" one customer asked. "Apparently it scared the living daylights out of that HOA guy." "Good. For him," another replied. "They've been getting away with too much for too long." Joe chuckled to himself as he paid for his coffee. He hadn't intended to become the talk of the town, but if his actions inspired others to stand up for themselves, he didn't mind being the center of attention for a while. Of course, not everyone was amused. The HOA board, upon hearing about the incident, was less than thrilled. They sent a formal letter to Joe the following afternoon, delivered by a courier who looked far too nervous to meet him face to face. The letter demanded that Joe disable the hazardous device on his gate immediately, citing concerns about safety and property damage. Joe read the letter with a bemused expression, shaking his head at the irony. Hazardous? His harmless contraption was nothing compared to the invasion of privacy the HOA had subjected him to. Still, he decided to respond politely, drafting a short note that summed up his feelings perfectly. "I'll be happy to remove the mechanism once you agree to stop trespassing on my property. Until then, feel free to enjoy the show." He mailed the note later that day, fully aware that it might ruffle a few feathers. But Joe wasn't worried. He knew he was in the right, and more importantly, he knew his neighbors had his back. For years, many of them had silently resented the HOA's overreach, but none had dared to challenge it openly. Now, thanks to Joe's clever stunt, they felt emboldened to speak up, or at least share a laugh at the inspector's expense. As the days went by, Joe kept a close watch on his fence, half expecting another attempt from the HOA. But strangely enough, no one came. Whether out of fear of triggering the gate again or sheer embarrassment over the previous incident, the inspectors seemed to have vanished altogether. Joe found himself enjoying the newfound peace, spending hours in his garden without interruption. Even the birds returned, chirping happily in the trees. Each evening, as the sun sank below the horizon and the sky turned shades of pink and gold, Joe would sit on his porch with a fresh glass of iced tea. He'd reflect on the events of the past week, feeling a quiet sense of pride. He hadn't set out to make a statement, but in standing up for himself, and indirectly for his neighbors, he'd sparked something bigger than he'd anticipated, and, though he didn't know it yet, his story was only beginning to spread beyond the confines of his little neighborhood. Reporters, bloggers, and curious onlookers would soon catch wind of the tale, turning Grandpa Joe into an unlikely hero. But for now, he was content to sip his tea, listen to the rustling leaves, and bask in the satisfaction of a job well done. After all, sometimes the simplest acts of defiance can lead to the most unexpected outcomes. Word of Grandpa Joe's buzzing gate spread faster than he could have imagined. What started as quiet whispers among neighbors soon turned into a full-blown topic of conversation throughout the community and beyond. By the end of the week, it seemed like everyone in town knew about the elderly mechanic who had outsmarted the HOA with his clever invention. People couldn't stop talking about it, and for good reason. It was the kind of story that made you smile, shake your head, and maybe even cheer a little. At first, the gossip stayed local. Neighbors exchanged knowing glances whenever they passed Joe's house. Some stopped by to congratulate him outright, while others simply nodded approvingly when they saw him tending to his garden or tinkering in his workshop. One afternoon, Mrs. Peterson from across the street brought over a plate of freshly baked cookies. "For the man of the hour," she said with a wink. Joe accepted them graciously, though he couldn't help but laugh at the idea of being called the man of the hour. But it wasn't just his immediate neighbors who were impressed. The buzz reached farther than Joe realized. At the local coffee shop, where people gathered each morning for lattes and gossip, the story became a staple of conversation. Regulars debated whether the HOA deserved what they got, speculated about how Joe had rigged the gate, and wondered if anyone would dare try climbing the fence again. Even the barista behind the counter chimed in saying, "If anyone messes with my hydrangeas, I hope I'm half as creative as Joe. The story took on a life of its own, growing more colorful. With each retelling, some versions claimed the gate emitted sparks, which it absolutely did not, while others insisted Joe had installed hidden cameras to catch trespassers in the act. He hadn't. A few embellishments even suggested the HOA inspector had fallen flat on his back after the burst of air hit him, a detail Joe thought was hilarious but unlikely. Despite the exaggerations, the core of the story remained true. An 80-year-old man had stood up to authority in a way that was both harmless and unforgettable. As the tale gained traction, it caught the attention of someone unexpected, a reporter from the local newspaper. On a crisp Saturday morning, a young woman named Sarah knocked on Joe's door, notebook in hand and a friendly smile on her face. She introduced herself as a journalist covering human interest stories and asked if she could interview him about the infamous gate. Joe hesitated for a moment. He didn't seek fame or attention, but something about Sarah's genuine curiosity won him over. He invited her to sit on the porch, poured her a glass of iced tea, and shared his side of the story. Sarah listened intently, scribbling notes as Joe explained why he'd rigged the gate and how he'd done it. She laughed at his descriptions of the inspector's reaction and nodded sympathetically when he talked about the frustration of dealing with the HOA. By the time the interview ended, Sarah promised to write a fair and accurate article. True to her word, the piece appeared in the Sunday edition of the paper under the headline, Grandpa Joe versus the HOA, How One Man's Ingenuity Stopped Trespassers in Their Tracks. The article was a hit. Readers loved Joe's blend of humor, creativity, and quiet defiance. Letters poured into the newspaper praising him for standing up to bureaucracy, and several residents wrote in to share their own frustrations with the HOA. One letter writer joked, "Maybe we should all install buzzing gates." Another admitted, "Joe gave me the courage to finally speak up about the HOA's ridiculous rules." The story didn't stop there. Within days, it was picked up by regional news outlets, then national ones. Social media platforms lit up with posts about Grandpa Joe, memes featuring gates and buzzing noises, and hashtags like Tying Team Joe and No More Fence Climbing. People from other states chimed in, sharing similar experiences with their own HOAs and marveling at Joe's ingenuity. Some even sent fan mail to his address, thanking him for inspiring them to take a stand against unfair practices in their communities. Despite the growing attention, Joe remained unfazed. He continued his daily routine, watering his plants, fixing things around the house, and enjoying his iced tea on the porch. When reporters called asking for follow-up interviews, he politely declined most of them. "I didn't do this for publicity," he told Sarah during a brief phone call. "I just wanted some peace and quiet." His humility only added to his appeal. People admired not just his cleverness, but also his calm demeanor and sense of humor. To many, Joe represented the everyday hero, the person who stands up for themselves without causing harm, using wit instead of anger to make a point. His story resonated deeply, especially in a world where tensions between individuals and institutions often felt insurmountable. Back in the neighborhood, the effects of Joe's actions were undeniable. The HOA, once seen as untouchable, suddenly seemed less intimidating. Neighbors began speaking up about issues they'd previously kept silent about, emboldened by Joe's example. At the next HOA meeting, several residents voiced concerns about the organization's methods, citing Joe's case as evidence that change was needed. While the board tried to brush off the criticism, it was clear their grip on the community was loosening. Even the inspectors changed their behavior. After the incident at Joe's house, none of them dared set foot near his property, let alone climb his fence. They stuck to public areas, knocking on doors and sending polite emails instead of sneaking through backyards. It was a small victory, but one that made a big difference in restoring trust between the HOA and the homeowners. One evening, as Joe sat on his porch watching the sunset, a neighbor stopped by to thank him personally. It was Mr. Thompson, the man who always waved during his morning walks but rarely spoke. Tonight, however, he lingered, leaning against the fence post with a thoughtful expression. "You've done us all a favor, Joe," Mr. Thompson said. Those inspectors have been backing off everyone since your little stunt. You might not realize it, but you've given us our neighborhood back." Joe smiled, tipping his hat. "I didn't do it for anyone else," he replied modestly. "Just wanted them to respect my space, but if it helps others too, well, that's a nice bonus." Mr. Thompson chuckled. Modest as ever. Still, don't underestimate the power of a good example. Sometimes all it takes is one person to remind everyone else that we're allowed to push back. The comment stayed with Joe long after Mr. Thompson left. He hadn't thought of himself as a role model, in fact, he still didn't, but hearing those words made him reflect on the bigger picture. Maybe his buzzing gate wasn't just about teaching the HOA a lesson. Maybe it was about showing people that standing up for yourself didn't have to involve shouting matches or lawsuits. Sometimes a little creativity and humor could go a long way. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Joe leaned back in his chair, savoring the peacefulness of the moment. For the first time in months, he felt truly relaxed. The fence climbing incidents had stopped. The neighborhood felt more united and life was returning to normal, or as close to normal as it could get after becoming an accidental celebrity. Joe raised his glass of iced tea in a silent toast to peace, creativity, and the power of a well-placed surprise. Whatever happened next, he knew he'd handled things exactly the way he wanted to, with kindness, humor, and a touch of mischief. And really, what more could an 80-year-old man ask for? Weeks turned into months and life in the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, one that felt lighter, freer, and more harmonious. The buzzing gate incident became a distant memory for some, but for Grandpa Joe, it marked the beginning of a subtle yet profound change. His clever invention had not only solved his problem with the HOA, but also sparked something bigger, a renewed sense of community spirit. The HOA inspectors, once so bold in their fence-climbing escapades, now avoided Joe's property altogether. Whether out of fear of triggering another surprise or simply out of respect for his boundaries, they stuck to formal channels, knocking on doors, sending emails, and scheduling appointments like any reasonable organization should. For Joe, this shift was all he'd ever wanted. He didn't harbor ill will toward the HOA. He just wanted them to treat him and everyone else with basic courtesy. As the weeks passed, Joe noticed other changes too. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves started reaching out more often. Mrs. Peterson brought over fresh baked pies every few Sundays, claiming she had too much batter, though Joe suspected otherwise. Mr. Thompson stopped by occasionally to borrow tools, using the opportunity to chat about everything from gardening tips to local politics. Even the kids next door, who used to race their bikes past his house without a second glance, now waved hello, and sometimes even helped him carry groceries inside. Joe found himself enjoying these interactions more than he expected. At 80 years old, he wasn't looking for new friendships necessarily, but there was something heartwarming about being part of a close-knit community again. It reminded him of earlier days when neighborhoods were places where people genuinely cared about one another, not just superficially polite acquaintances tied together by shared property lines. One sunny afternoon, as Joe watered his vegetable patch, a young boy named Timmy wandered into his yard. Timmy lived 2 houses down and was known for his boundless energy and curiosity. Today, however, he seemed unusually shy. "Hey there, Timmy," Joe greeted warmly, setting down the watering can. "What brings you here?" Timmy shuffled his feet, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his hands. I heard about your gate," he said hesitantly. "The one that buzzes." Joe chuckled. "Ah, yes, that old thing. What about it?" "Well," Timmy hesitated, then blurted out, "Can you teach me how to make something like that? Not to scare people. Of course, just, something cool." Joe raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Something cool, huh? Well, I suppose we could come up with a project. But first, let's talk about why you want to build it. Any good invention starts with a purpose." Timmy thought for a moment. Maybe I could make something to keep raccoons out of our trash cans. They're always tipping them over at night." Joe grinned. "Now that's a worthy cause. Let's see what we can do." Over the next several weekends, Joe and Timmy worked together in the workshop, tinkering with wires, motors, and scraps of metal. Joe taught the boy the basics of mechanics and problem solving, encouraging him to think creatively and experiment. Together, they built a simple device, a motion-activated sprinkler designed to startle raccoons away from trash cans. When it was finally finished, Timmy beamed with pride, and Joe felt a surge of satisfaction knowing he'd passed on a bit of his knowledge to the next generation. Word of their collaboration spread quickly, and soon other kids in the neighborhood began showing interest. Parents encouraged their children to visit Joe's workshop, hoping they might learn something practical, or at least stay entertained during the summer holidays. Before long, Joe found himself hosting informal tinkering sessions on Saturday, mornings where kids gathered to build gadgets, fix broken toys, and ask endless questions about how things worked. For Joe, these sessions were a joy. Watching the children's eyes light up as they figured out solutions to problems reminded him of his own childhood, when he'd spent hours taking apart radios and clocks just to understand how they ticked. It also gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Though he no longer worked as a mechanic, mentoring the kids made him feel useful again. And while he never sought recognition, the gratitude from parents and the admiration from the kids filled him with quiet pride. Meanwhile, the HOA continued to evolve, albeit slowly. The board members, perhaps sensing the growing dissatisfaction among residents, began holding more open meetings and inviting feedback. Some rules were relaxed, others clarified, and a few particularly unpopular ones were scrapped altogether. While Joe doubted the changes would last forever, he appreciated the effort. After all, progress often came in small steps. By fall, the neighborhood felt different, not dramatically so, but enough to notice. People smiled more, waved more, and took the time to chat when they crossed paths. There was a sense of camaraderie that hadn't existed before, a feeling that they were all in this together. And at the center of it all was Joe, the unassuming hero whose buzzing gait had inadvertently brought everyone closer. One crisp October evening, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, the neighbors threw a small gathering in Joe's honor. It wasn't anything fancy, just a potluck dinner held in his backyard, but it meant the world to him. Tables were laden with homemade dishes, casseroles, pies, salads, and of course plenty of iced tea. Strings of fairy lights twinkled above, casting a warm glow over the festivities. As the sun dipped below the horizon, someone suggested making a toast. Mrs. Peterson stood up, raising her glass. "To Joe," she said, her voice ringing clear. "For reminding us that standing up for ourselves doesn't have to mean fighting dirty. For teaching us that creativity and kindness can go hand in hand. And for being the heart and soul of this neighborhood." Everyone clapped and cheered, and Joe, sitting modestly in his chair, couldn't help but tear up a little. He raised his own glass, clearing his throat. "Thank you all," he said softly. "But I didn't do anything special. I just wanted a little peace and quiet. If my little stunt inspired anyone else to speak up or stand tall, then I'm glad for that. But don't thank me, thank yourselves. You're the ones who've made this neighborhood what it is today." His words earned another round of applause, followed by laughter and stories shared under the starlit sky. As the night wore on, Joe sat back and watched the scene unfold, feeling deeply content. He didn't need fame or fortune. He had everything he needed right here: his garden, his tools, his memories, and most importantly, his community. When the party finally wound down and the last guests departed, Joe lingered outside for a while, longer. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from a nearby fireplace. He gazed at his gate, now silent and unused, and smiled to himself. It had served its purpose well, not just as a deterrent, but as a catalyst for change. With a final stretch, Joe headed indoors, ready to turn in for the night. As he climbed the stairs to his bedroom, he paused briefly to look out the window at the quiet street below. Lights glowed softly in neighboring homes, and the sound of distant laughter drifted through the air. It was a peaceful scene, one that filled him with gratitude. Grandpa Joe slipped into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, and perhaps even new adventures. But for now he closed his eyes, content in the knowledge that he'd made a difference, not with grand gestures or fiery speeches, but with a touch of ingenuity, a splash of humor, and a whole lot of heart. And somewhere, deep down, he knew the story of the buzzing gate would live on, for years to come.